This is BreakPoint This Week, a weekly briefing on faith, culture, worldview, and mission with John Stonestreet, president of the Colson Center for Christian Worldview.
Ideas have consequences, bad ideas have victims. Welcome to BreakPoint This Week. I'm John Stonestreet here along with Warren Smith, talking about the stories of the week from a Christian worldview. Each and every week. And Warren, great to be back with you again, although, unfortunately, we had two shootings to talk about.
Yeah, unfortunately.
It's like a weekly occurrence.
One in my hometown of Charlotte, North Carolina, but I know, John, probably the one you want to spend most of the time with is the synagogue shooting that happened out in California.
Well, yeah, and for a number of reasons, not only because it's another example of anti-Semitic violence, and we've seen far too many of those in recent days, if you talk about the Tree of Life Synagogue shooting not that long ago. But our colleague, Shane Morris, who's one of our BreakPoint writers, writes columns, also writes over at Pathos and other places, wrote a terrific piece, and I want to bring people's attention to it. Here's the title of Shane's piece: A Quiet Piano-Playing Presbyterian Mass Shooter. I mean, we've become used to, Warren, the shooters that we see. If you think about folks like Dylan Roof, Adam Lanza, they do tend to fit a profile, and people of kind of desperate, lonely individuals. They're disconnected from society. And in many ways, this shooter was as well. But of course, the difference was, as Shane wrote, he was a 19-year-old college student with a 4.31 GPA in high school. He loved to play the piano. His dad, and this is the most disturbing part for all of us, his dad was an elder, or is an elder, in the Orthodox Presbyterian church. And I think that's what triggered really Shane to write the piece that he did. But this one is what made this one hard to stomach. It's easy to kind of line up these individuals and say they're not one of us. And of course, no one that does this sort of thing is one of us. None of them are ever acting in Christ. But to claim that makes it a very, very difficult situation, especially because we're not talking about a fringe group here. We're talking about the Orthodox Presbyterian Church.
Yeah, that's right. It is a great denomination generally. But, you know, the point that Shane makes, which I think is a great point to make, and one worth reiterating here, John, is that despite a great family, despite a great church, despite active involvement in his community, Shane makes the point that even with all of that, there are so many cultural forces out there competing with those great influences for the attention of our young people. And apparently in this particular case, some of those competing forces, those other forces that were not so solid, not so strong, not so positive, won.
Yeah, listen to this, what Shane wrote, and we're going to link to this. Come to breakpoint.org, click on the link there on the homepage that says resources mentioned on the radio and podcast. No one noticed Ernest going bad, not even those closest to him, Shane writes. His parents say they raised him to reject hate and show love. They describe his turn toward evil as a terrifying mystery. Everyone's surprised and shocked. And of course, most people say that. I mean, actually not always. I mean, we had many cases of mass shooters over the last decade or so where the classmates were like, yeah, this guy, espoused racist views, or this guy actually, we all kind of wondered and that sort of thing. But not this guy. I mean, this guy's, in a church. And the reach of the darker parts of the web, the necessity of rejecting, verbally and out front in front of our kids, bad ideology. And I'm talking about anti-Christian ideology in whatever form that it is. If you're not willing to have these conversations with your kids, the culture is, and a lot of times through some of these channels, that we saw in this case.
Yeah, and I think social media and the internet, I mean, we can't just blame those forces and say, well, they're too powerful, they're overwhelming, what's a mother to do kind of a thing. We do have to take responsibility as parents to raise our children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, no matter what culture we live in.
Yeah, the other thing that I thought, and I've just been kind of brought back to Alexander Solzhenitsyn for the last 4 years, really. And it was really leading up to the election, after the election. We talked about Solzhenitsyn's terrific Harvard speech, which I think just had the 40th anniversary just a year or so ago. But there's also a line in the Gulag Archipelago in which he says, if only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it was only necessary for us to separate them from the rest of us and then destroy them. I think that's the other thing that this story reminds us of. is that we now have too many stories of how folks can be radicalized from within normal families, even from within church communities, in the West. And if we think somehow the problem is them and the problem is out there, we're missing a biblical understanding of the fall. I mean, I'm convinced, Warren, that if Christians are going to understand this cultural moment, we got to have a solid grounding in a doctrine of creation, which includes the image of God, and a doctrine of the fall. Before we get to the salvation and the redemption stuff, we need to know who we are. We need to know what's wrong with us. We need to know the problem's not just out there. And Solzhenitsyn goes on to say, but the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. Yeah, we got to take responsibility. And I'm not saying that everyone is capable of this sort of evil in and of themselves, but everyone's capable of going down a path towards hate, towards bitterness, towards lust, towards, you fill in the blank. And no one decides, one day to wake up and become a serial killer. No one wakes up one day and decides to become, to cheat on their wife. It is as Andrew, not Andrew, the other Peterson.
Eugene Peterson.
Eugene Peterson.
Yeah,
wow.
That's right.
So I had a Wilberforce weekend moment there.
Yeah, we like them both.
We do, yeah. It was Eugene Peterson quoting, Nietzsche said, life is a long obedience in the same direction. And the problem's not just out there. It's in here as well. Well, you're listening to BreakPoint this week. John Stonestreet here along with Warren Smith. I want everyone to read this incredible article by our colleague Shane Morris. He is a fantastic talent, but he really, really hit it out of the park with this one. It's important content. Come to breakpoint.org, click on the link there on the homepage that says resources mentioned on the radio and podcast, and we'll link you to the various resources that we mentioned in today's program, but especially this article by Shane. And again, the title's worth the price of admission, A Quiet, Piano-Playing, Presbyterian Mass Shooter. You're listening to BreakPoint This Week. I'm John Stonestreet with Warren Smith. We'll be right back.
We invite you to visit breakpoint.org. While you're at our website, be sure to browse our online Colson Center store of great books and other resources. And you can link up to our social media sites like Facebook and Twitter.
Welcome back to BreakPoint This Week. I'm Warren Smith with John Stonestreet. And, John, another big story that happened in the last week or so was a decision by Bethany Christian Services to start placing children. They're probably the nation's largest Christian adoption services, and they work in foster care and just all kinds of arenas in states all across the country. But they made a decision based on a difficult situation that they were in to start placing kids with LGBT families as part of a court settlement. And I think it's hard to know what to think about this. I mean, Bethany was in an extraordinarily difficult position. If they didn't comply with this court ruling, they were probably going to have to shut down, or at least shut down in one state, and that would compromise their ability to work with thousands and thousands of other families. On the other hand, it is a compromise of principle, and I don't think there's any doubt about that.
Yeah, look, this is kind of the new normal. We're going to have to figure out going forward what it looks like to walk in Christian faithfulness in an extraordinarily difficult situation when you have the power of the state coercing this. We talked about this in weeks past, and I think the good occasion to talk about it again, not only this story, but we've just received copies of a new book that I had the privilege of co-editing with David Dockery, the president of Trinity International University, really kind of reflecting on the commitments of the Manhattan Declaration. And the Manhattan Declaration closed by saying, we will ungrudgingly render to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, but we can never render to Caesar what belongs to God. That's a document that dates back 10 years, 2009. And you look back then and you think, what was Caesar claiming in 2009? Well, we kind of saw what was coming in terms of marriage, and we kind of saw what was coming in terms of religious liberty, but really it was just life. 10 years later, Caesar's really laying claim on all three. And Caesar is not only, what happens in D.C. In this case, it's what happens, in the state of Michigan. We've talked about how important the states are when it comes to life. We can also say, living in Colorado and seeing what the Colorado Civil Rights Commission did to Jack Phillips, making him choose between his existence as a Christian baker and kind of his convictions. That's what really happened here in the state of Michigan, where basically the state of Michigan said to Bethany Christian Services, you got to put kids in with same-sex couples. Here's what's difficult about this. This was in the state of Michigan. Obviously what's going to happen there is going to trickle around the states, but Bethany, of course, is nationwide. They had to make this decision. Of course, advocates of LGBT advocates would say this is a form of public accommodation. It's not, just because there are plenty of other ways for LGBT couples to get accommodated in adoption. That's not a controversial thing in our culture anymore. I would say wrongly, but it's not a controversial thing anymore. And Bethany decided to change their minds. So what do you do? Do you fight it? Do you sue? Do you take it to the Supreme Court? What's at stake here? There's a bunch of things to say. Bethany has, for decades, done heroic work in helping, what James says is one of the kind of the marks of true Christianity, taking care of orphans and widows. And they've done the orphan part, and they've done it really, really, really well. So this is when you're forced to choose, do we stop serving all of those kids because of this conviction? Catholic Charities in Boston said, that they could not cross that line. That was a line too far. And they've served, heroically, thousands and thousands of children through their life as well. There's also, when one group won't defend their rights as their religious freedom, it becomes really difficult for other groups to do it.
Yep.
And that's another part of this story. But this is also going to be the new normal. We're going to have to decide, where's the line?
Well, I think, John, my frustration with this decision, and again, I don't want to throw Bethany under the bus, and as you said, let's stipulate for the record that they've done really great work over the years. It just did not seem to me, from reading the stories, and I'm not an expert on this, that Bethany exhausted every possible line of action available to them. This decision was the sort of the outcome of a 2017 lawsuit that the American Civil Liberties Union had filed. It was part of a settlement. To my knowledge, this had not gone up in the court system. It certainly had not gone to the Supreme Court. I just struggle with understanding why Bethany would make this choice in what appears to be a very early stage in the process, rather than fighting this the whole way. Because, John, you and I know that there are great organizations like Alliance Defending Freedom, which we've at the Colson Center we've worked with for years, that would be glad to take a case like this.
Yeah, we think so, and I want to just be clear. There's a lot of these back details, and one of the things that I appreciate about Alliance Defending Freedom and Beckett and some of these other organizations is that they're not just interested in just fighting cases to fight cases. They're not just even interested in fighting cases that may or may not win on the wrong legal precedent. So there may be facts and details to this case that we don't know.
That's right.
But I have those same questions that you do, just because there's so much at stake here. And it goes back to, again, we're talking about kids, right? And we had this conversation this week in our editorial team. I just about every time that I speak on the topic of the sexual revolution and the sweeping way that the sexual revolution has run through culture in the last several decades, is the kids being experimented with. We started the show, ideas have consequences, bad ideas have victims, and kids are always the victims of the bad ideas of the sexual revolution. You can line them up. There's dozens and dozens of examples about this. And so now we have, again, and that's why I don't think same-sex adoptions are the right move. Mom and dad, they don't dad and dad, they don't mom and mom. It's just there's, as Ryan Anderson often says, there's no such thing as parents. There's only moms and dads, because mother's mother and father's father. And we shouldn't be intentionally setting up situations where that's actually not the loving, kind outcome.
Yep.
That's why this is a line too far. That's why, again, we've got to go back. A lot of people look at the Manhattan Declaration and say, well, look at everything that happened in 10 years. Look how much went wrong. It was a failure. The Manhattan Declaration was never a statement saying culture shouldn't go here. The Manhattan Declaration was always a statement saying Christians can't go here. And that's a huge distinction, because we don't know always how far down culture will have to go before there's some sort of reaction, recovery, or pendulum swing. So Christians have to decide where they stand based on the story of Scripture, not the moment of culture. And so this is a hard one. This is a really, really hard one. And there's going to be ramifications beyond Bethany to a whole lot of other organizations. So it's a painful one because, again, of the terrific work they've done for so long. Come to breakpoint.org, click on the link there on the homepage that says resources mentioned on the radio and podcast, and we'll link you to that story as well. I want to talk about something that came out on Thursday. Back in 2017, President Trump issued an executive order, and at the time, I was pretty critical of it. I admit it was an executive order on religious liberty. It seemed to be what many people called kind of vacuous, but there were promises that there were more things coming. Well, on Thursday, another thing came, and it was, I think, a pretty significant move by the department, particularly the Department of Health and Human Services, finalized their policy protecting individual and healthcare entities from discrimination on the basis of their exercising their conscience in HHS-funded programs. Now, HHS was one of the big levers under the Obama administration for removing religious liberty, for what counts as a religious organization being shrunk to the point of small churches and no one involved in outreach. We all remember the famous HHS mandate. That's kind of when I really got on the religious liberty bandwagon at that point. And it tells you a lot of things. Elections have consequences because elections come with departments. They don't just come with one individual. There's entire departments that come along with it. It also tells you how important worldview is. I mean, you look at the worldview of Kathleen Sebelius, who was the director of HHS under President Obama, and the worldview of Roger Severino, who's now the director of Health and Human Services, and you see completely different understandings of how Americans should be able to operate to best fulfill the mission of HHS. Dramatic difference, and so it's pretty important.
Yeah, it is important, and I think it does show one other thing as well, and that is the idea, at least in government, that personnel is policy. Because as you said, John, President Trump issued the executive order in May of 2017. That's a full 2 years ago now, and it's taken 2 years for these policies to be put in place. And the reason for that, one of the reasons for that is, number one, these are complicated policies. It does take time just generally, but also you got to make sure you have the right staff down in the organization that are going to carry out your, sort of your top line, your executive edict from the White House. And it's taken the president a while to get his administration staffed all the way down the line. And now here we are with these new regulations, which I agree with you, they're great. The May 2017 executive order was something of an empty suit, but this round of regulations really sort of fills out that suit, and it's all good. But now we're within 18 months of another presidential election, and they could all be undone. And after having been in effect only 18 to 20 months, if the election goes one way versus another way. So I guess part of the one of the final lessons here, in addition to all the things you said and what I said about personnel being policy, is that we've got to be ever vigilant, that the battle never ends.
No, it doesn't. And, that's one of the things about where we're at. I mean, people need to understand, too, that personnel's policy and also executive orders kind of create and add layers to what is a deeply woven kind of administrative state. And what we were told, and I was told this after kind of being somewhat critical of the executive order being an empty suit, is that under the last administration there was so many there's so much administrative red tape that getting through it all and unwinding it all was just going to take a lot of time. Yep. Otherwise there would be some unintended consequences. And my guess is that that's the new normal, is that not only are we going to operate, and this is something that needs to be debated in terms of, is this the way we want to govern? Is this the way we want to be governed? It's just by executive order, which is becoming increasingly normal. You get the legislative branch, which is supposed to give legislation, and really the rules that are coming for our society are coming from the courts and coming from the president. And that's something in and of itself. But I think, too, the executive orders are coming with their own rounds of red tape so that they're hard to unwind. And so at least it takes this long into the next administration to do it. But this is it's interesting. By the way, Warren, I was on Thursday night with one of my favorite groups, the Christian Medical and Dental Society. and led by David Stevens, who has been there for 25 years, stepping down this year, will be transitioning later on this year. One of the great guys, truly great leaders that I know, has just done remarkable work with that organization, and I know that they were pleased because the main thing this does is it protects doctors and nurses and dentists and physical therapists and so on with conscience and convictions about certain issues, that they can actually practice medicine and help people out of their deeply held convictions. So they were pretty pleased with this one. Well, you're listening to BreakPoint This Week. I'm John Stonestreet here with Warren Smith. Stay with us.
You can learn more about BreakPoint and the Colson Center for Christian Worldview when you visit breakpoint.org. That's breakpoint.org.
We're back on BreakPoint This Week. Warren, I got one more story here I want to talk about, and I'm going to punt this one really to you, because we've had this conversation numerous times. One of the clickbait things that attracts us on social media is best places to visit, most sinful cities, things like that. And you have opinion about these kind of best places to live sorts of surveys that we see pop up in various forms. And Wallet Hub just attempted to rate the most sinful cities, which is interesting. I don't know if they were holding up most sinful cities as that's why you want to visit, or you don't want to visit.
Right.
Freddie Mercury, this a Freddie Mercury or a Billy Graham sort of approach. But anyway,
Yep.
You've got strong feelings about these kind of city surveys.
Well, I do. I mean, first of all, let me just say that I'm a sucker for them. I mean, anytime I see a survey, the 100 best colleges in the country, or the best cities to live or best cities to retire, I mean, I'm usually one of the first ones to click on them. Partly because of that, I have observed that there is a worldview behind the survey, that this is not an objective look at these towns. So, for example, you look at a survey about best workplaces. The best places to work if you're a millennial might be, a typical example of a kind of a survey, and they would get a high rating because they have LGBTQ interest groups within the employees, or they have an LGBTQ Facebook page for the employees of that particular organization, and so they would get a higher rating as being a place for millennials to work, as opposed to an organization that might not have that particular feature. And clearly, there is a worldview component to deciding that this aspect of work is good and this aspect of work is not good. And the Sinful Cities study, I think, fits into that category. I will say that this one is better than most. It actually took the classic 7 deadly sins of gluttony and lust and greed and so on, and tried to rank various cities. And there are a lot of flaws in the study, but there are also some pretty interesting aspects to the study as well. Los Angeles, New York, Houston, St. Louis were near the top of the survey, Las Vegas being number 1.
No way.
Yes,
no way. You're
that's
kidding.
right, Sin City. South Barrington, Vermont was ranked 182nd, or the very last, the lowest ranking on the most sinful city list. Now, I don't even know where South Burlington, Vermont is, to be perfectly honest, John. I don't mean to offend the good people of South Burlington, Vermont, but it's clearly a small city, and I think that's one of the themes of this survey, is that the big cities tended to do worse and the small cities tended to do better. They also, rated things like violent crime, for example, and a lot of violent crime is often a feature of a large city, though unfortunately, as we're discovering, violent crime can take place in smaller cities as well. I guess my larger point, my concluding point would be these surveys are fun, they're interesting, they can sometimes tell us things about ourselves, and that's why I'm, like I say, a sucker for them, but we need to be really, really careful about how we consume not only this particular species of journalism, but all other forms of journalism as well.
All that said, I was in Las Vegas a couple weeks ago to speak at a pregnancy care center banquet. A terrific group there in Las Vegas. Met a bunch of believers. It was in a huge banquet. I think it was almost 1,000 people that showed up. It was actually at a casino, believe it or not. I've not spoken at a casino. The conference space was nice, but it was at the Rio Grande, which apparently was a casino at the top of their game in 1981, and it has not aged well. And but I tell you, there was a group of believers there that are doing remarkable work for the pro-life cause specifically, but even beyond that. Well, thanks for joining us today on BreakPoint this week. I want to mention, we talked several times today about the Manhattan Declaration 10th anniversary. Two things for you. First of all, we asked a group of thought leaders to react to the Manhattan Declaration 10 years later and the statements and the convictions there. And so we have about 15 or 16 top-tier thinkers, many of whom signed the Declaration, some of whom didn't, but have commented on that in our online symposium. Come to breakpoint.org, click on the link for this program. We'll link you there, or also click on the link there on the homepage that says resources mentioned on the radio and podcast. And also, as I mentioned earlier, we got a new book, and this is a collection of 15 different essays, and contributors include Randy Alcorn, Johnny Erickson Tada, Rick Warren, Robbie George, Timothy George, Bruce Ashford, Russell Moore, and Andrew Walker, and the list goes on and on. Frederica Matthews Green, Dr. Jennifer Roback Morris. It is an outstanding lineup of Christian thinkers talking about what life, marriage, and religious liberty, what Christian conviction in those areas looks like today. You can find out information, again, by coming to breakpoint.org. And Warren, we got a webinar coming up about the Manhattan Declaration as well.
We sure do, John. You and I are going to be on that webinar together. We're going to talk about the book. By the way, I should say congratulations. It's a fantastic book. You and David Dockery sort of pulled that project together, and it's, as you say, it's an amazing collection. But it's going to be May 9th. That's next Thursday, 1 o'clock Eastern Time. It's absolutely free. We're going to talk about the book, but we're more importantly going to talk about the issues that the book discusses, marriage, life, and religious liberty, and why the Manhattan Declaration is just as relevant today as it's ever been.
Well, thanks for joining us today on BreakPoint this week. Again, come to breakpoint.org for these resources. For Warren Smith, I'm John Stonestreet. See you next time.